Representative James Raskin, speaking before the House Judiciary Committee, delivers a measured but forceful response to claims about the shooting of Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old unarmed U.S. citizen killed by an ICE agent in Minneapolis. Raskin challenges attempts to frame the killing as self-defense, referencing legal precedent and highlighting systemic issues in law enforcement accountability, particularly within ICE and Homeland Security. His remarks underscore the gap between law, policy, and practice, demanding immediate congressional oversight.
Intervene here only because I want to respond to my friend from North Carolina, who I think starts with the incontrovertible point that it's wrong to prejudge whether this was murder. Then it is equally wrong to prejudge that it's self-defense. And I hope that that my colleague, with his astute prosecutorial understanding, would just as much reprove the Attorney General and the President for going out and claiming this was self-defense without a complete investigation, especially when all the evidence of our senses would suggest if we're going to jump to a conclusion, we should jump to a conclusion that this was murder and not self-defense. But that's why we have the law. That's why we have a legal process. Now, the gentleman correctly states the situation, except he aborts the analysis midway. He says, well, she was told to stop, she was told not to go anywhere, but still she drove her car away. And I certainly saw that. The Supreme Court has a decision just on this point, which I'm sure the gentleman knows. It was decided in 1985. Everybody in criminal procedure learns it. Tennessee versus Garner, 1985, because Tennessee had a statute which said if there is someone fleeing the police, they can be shot. And the Supreme Court said that's not the rule. They can only be shot if they're fleeing the police if the police have probable cause to believe that the suspect poses a significant threat of death or danger to other people. Now, Ms. Good, who's a 37-year-old mom of a 6-year-old boy, now orphaned by ICE, posed no threat to anybody. At least, as far as we can tell, there's no suggestion that she posed a reasonable threat to anybody. That's the legal question. Now, I think our committee should launch an investigation into this. This would be a worthwhile subject for us to get into at this point. But the idea that simply because she disobeyed an order that she can be shot in the face at point blank is wrong. That's not the law in the United States of America. And you know who knows that? Everybody on this side of the aisle who talks about Ashley Babbitt. Because everybody talking about Ashley Babbitt seems to think that, well, she was told repeatedly to turn around and to leave, and then she still tried to use violence to get into our chamber, into the speaker's lobby, in order to get at us. And she was shot and repelled. And there were 2 different investigations which found that that was reasonable force used by the police because she was coming at them. But what we had in this case was this woman was trying to leave. She was trying to get away from it. She wasn't coming at the police. She was trying to get away from the police. So to the extent that we want to engage in an immediate post-mortem analysis, and I agree with the gentleman that this is why we have law. This is why we have a real legal investigation, and it is completely irresponsible for the president and the attorney general to be out there claiming against all evidence that this was self-defense. This is why we have law. Okay, then we should wait until we can make a final pronouncement upon that. But let's at least get down what the law is. This is the House Judiciary Committee. And people cannot be shot in the face simply because they walk away from a police officer. And especially when we've got police officers who are masked. And I just want to finish on this point, and I'm happy to yield to my friend. Because look, all of us represent jurisdictions. We've got local police, we've got county police, we've got state police. None of them are masked. We've got the Army, we've got the Navy, we've got the Marines. None of them are masked. We've got the National Guard. None of them are masked. Why is ICE masked? This is what we want to know. Nobody's given us a good answer for this. Now, one suggestion comes from the fact that we have multiple January 6th defendants who are working at the Department of Justice itself, including Ed Martin and Jared Wise. So if they're hiring them at the Department of Justice, presumably they're hiring them at the Homeland Security and ICE, and maybe they don't want them to be identified because, of course, those people were very well video documented on the day of January 6th. There's a lot of suspicion that that's why these people are being masked, and they're not even telling us why they're being masked. But it's precisely this episode which demonstrates why people are afraid of ICE and will try to move away from ICE rather than submit to their order, even when people need to submit to a lawful order of the police. Happy to yield to the gentleman.
Representative James Raskin's remarks to the House Judiciary Committee illuminate the full scope of what happened in Minneapolis and the legal and operational failures surrounding the death of Renee Nicole Good. At 37 years old, Ms. Good was an unarmed mother of a 6-year-old boy, shot 3 times by an ICE agent as she attempted to drive away on a residential street. The circumstances of her death, captured on multiple videos, directly contradict claims that the officer faced an imminent threat or acted in self-defense. Raskin draws on the Supreme Court decision Tennessee v. Garner, 1985, which makes clear that fleeing individuals may only be shot if the officer has probable cause to believe they pose a significant threat of death or serious harm to others. By that standard, Ms. Good posed no clear threat, and the use of lethal force was legally unjustified. Raskin emphasizes the difference between Ms. Good's situation and cases like Ashley Babbitt during the January 6th attack, where lethal force was considered reasonable because she actively posed a threat to law enforcement. Ms. Good, in contrast, was moving away from the officers, attempting to avoid confrontation. This distinction underlines not only the inappropriate use of force, but also a troubling pattern in how federal agencies assess threats and justify actions. It highlights a lack of accountability and the potential for deadly errors when officers operate without clear oversight or adherence to established protocols. The operational concerns Raskin raises are equally troubling. ICE agents were masked, a stark contrast to local police, the National Guard, and military personnel, whose identities are typically visible. Masking not only shields officers from accountability, but may contribute to a climate of fear and hesitation among the public, where compliance with lawful orders is discouraged by uncertainty or mistrust. Raskin also notes that several January 6th defendants, including Ed Martin and Jared Wise, are employed at DOJ and potentially in Homeland Security and ICE. This overlap raises questions about hiring practices, internal culture, and whether prior political involvement affects conduct or accountability in law enforcement roles. Raskin also challenges the premature statements by the President and Attorney General, who labeled the incident self-defense without completing an investigation. Such statements undermine legal due process and erode public confidence in federal institutions. The case is not just a question of individual misconduct, but of systemic oversight failure. ICE's training protocols, including approaches to vehicles, were reportedly ignored in this case, suggesting either gaps in training or toleration of deviations by leadership. Combined with the reported obstruction of medical aid to Ms. Good, these facts paint a picture of an agency operating with insufficient accountability, creating conditions where tragedies are likely to occur. Raskin frames the incident as a test of institutional responsibility and the rule of law. Congress, and specifically the Judiciary Committee, has the duty to investigate, demand transparency, and ensure that federal agencies act within legal and ethical boundaries. The death of Renee Nicole Good, which left her child orphaned, reflects both human tragedy and the consequences of systemic failure. By connecting legal precedent, operational lapses, and the public's right to oversight, Raskin highlights the urgent need for independent investigation and reform. He calls for testimony from DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, Acting ICE Director Todd Lyons, and Attorney General Pam Bondi, insisting that accountability, transparency, and strict adherence to legal standards are essential to restoring trust in federal law enforcement. Without immediate action, the risks to public safety, civil rights, and democratic oversight will continue to grow, signaling that this is not an isolated incident, but a structural problem requiring a decisive response.